all you writers who read. I'm Gary McBride, and I'm joined by Whitney Pinion and Mira Landry. Now, we've all been told that to become better writers, we need to be better readers, but no one says how. Well, this podcast is all about how. By reading and analyzing a new novel published within the past 2 years, our discussions focus on the underlying techniques, how the author used them, and why. We don't criticize, we don't judge, we study and dig in, and what we seek is what we can apply to our own writing. We are writers who read. It's January 7th, 2024. I'm Gary McBride.
I'm Whitney Pinion.
And I'm Mira Landry.
Today's novel is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus, published in April of 2022.
Bonnie Garmus had previously written a book that had something like 98 rejections, mostly because
it was more than 700 pages long.
She wrote a 700-page novel.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. She did 98 queries to agents and got a hard no on every one. Mm-hmm. And so her takeaway from that was, don't write a 700-page novel and expect to have anyone get interested in it.
Not as a debut. No, it's literally if your word count is over 200,000, you can almost get up to 200,000 if your pitch is really good and your opening is really, really good. But I mean, anything over pretty much 100 outside of that, you don't have it. It's too long.
J.K. Rowling, they edited her down to a hard 85,000 words for the first book. But eventually it went over 1 million words, right? Because the books kept getting longer and longer. Mm-hmm. But because she had a track record.
People were going to read it. And they knew. And this is a problem. And it probably was true also with Bonnie Garmus's first book. Anyway, back to her story. She took a 3-month writing course with Curtis Brown Literary Agency, where she met Felicity Blunt, Stanley Tucci's wife.
Emily Blunt's sister.
Emily Blunt's sister, who is one of the bigger literary agents in London.
So she was at Curtis Brown, right? Mm-hmm. And so she got to meet a lot of other authors. And Curtis Brown is run by the agents.
Curtis Brown is an agency.
Right. It is an agency that also has a writing school.
Yes.
And so they hosted a cocktail party, and she just happened to fall into conversation with Felicity Blunt. And she got signed on the strength of 10,000 words.
I mean, Bonnie's story is that, she said, well, I won't have it done for a little while. But Felicity was emailed her or contacted her and said, is the book done yet? And she's like, well, no, I said it was going to take longer. And then Felicity said, come in anyway. Let's see what you got. And then just said, I'm going to sign you. I trust you.
By the way, did you go to see her at the Boulder Bookstore?
I saw
Bonnie
her.
Garmus?
She was at the church. I forget what the church was, but it was a very big. Yeah, I saw her live here.
There's a venue here somewhere in the Boulder area.
I saw her live here. Yes.
Okay, so bigger than the Boulder Bookstore, right?
Way bigger than the bookstore could handle. Yes.
But oh my God, is she entertaining to listen to?
Oh,
She's incredible. I would love to just have her
on the podcast.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great? A boy can dream. No, but she's just the most amazing. She has the most story after story, and you can tell she's got this wicked, wonderful sense of humor. And
it shows up in her book.
And she told a story on herself about the cocktail party that she asked Felicity, because she was trying to make small talk, right? She's talking to Felicity. It's like Felicity was talking about her husband, and Bonnie Garmus, who had no idea who she was talking to, said, "Oh, interesting. He's an actor. Would I have seen him in anything?" And she answered, "Yeah, maybe. You might."
I would have totally done something like that. I would have been like, the name sounds so familiar. Maybe he's a musician. I'm just
no, but she's so self-effacing. She tells stories on herself all the time.
No, she's wonderfully genuine, and clearly, is similar to Elizabeth Zott, has a strong sense of morals and goals. She clearly wrote this book. I mean, she tells how she sat down and wrote the first chapter after a terrible meeting in which none of her male coworkers stood up for her.
I've got the story. Do you want the story from The Guardian? This was what she told The Guardian. Highly experienced copywriter in the tech industry, Garmus gave a presentation for $1 million campaign to a room full of male colleagues. It was greeted with silence, she recalls. Finally, this man who hadn't met me before speaks up. Well, I'll tell you what I think we should do. And then he basically just read my presentation start to finish. When she pointed out that she had already said all that, he ignored her as if she wasn't there. That's brilliant. The colleagues congratulated him. So it was basically, he took her idea, presented it to the group of male colleagues. And then she went back to her office angry and wrote
the entire first chapter, which
the
is
whole first chapter.
not that long.
And then the end of
and
this
the last
book.
3 lines of the book, which, by the way, made it into the final edit, which is very cool.
Remarkable.
Yeah. So very, very cool story from Bonnie Garmus going from there. And like, man, I just think when you think about doing something out of spite, like that's a great way to do it. Like, you told me I didn't know what I was doing. And then I just went and wrote a best-selling novel as my debut that's been on the bestsellers list for 86 weeks by this point.
Yeah.
By January 14th.
She has another lovely story. In one of the book signings, one of those 10 men came to the book signing and had a stack of 10 books in his hand that he wanted her to sign. And he goes up to the desk where she's sitting and he says, "Thank you for not giving any of our names. Like, thank you for not mentioning." Right? And he said, "I'm going to send one of these books to each of the 10 men who were in that room."
Oh, that's a
amazing.
great story.
Cool? Yeah. I'm reminded of a little more backstory on the story here, which is after Garmus failed to sell her 700-page novel, and I don't know how long after, but she started writing a second novel about Mad Zot. Isn't that interesting? And then after that horrible day with those 10 men at the office, she started writing a story about Mad's mother.
Which is interesting because that's how the chapter begins. She's not referred to as Elizabeth Zott in the first paragraph. She's referred to as Madeline Zott's mother.
You bring up something much more interesting, which is why Calvin needed to die. It's right there in the first paragraph. I'm not joking. One of the quotes that I found from Bonnie Garmus, which I really liked, which I showed at the meeting today, is this. This is a quote from the author. "The truth is, Elizabeth Zott is based on the fundamentals of Stoicism as written by Marcus Aurelius, which are self-responsibility and courage and logic and bravery, and that is her." So from this, I'm taking that Garmus used as a template a classical Stoic, someone who is a moral character, who knows right from wrong, who is not afraid of doing the right thing, and who doesn't back down from injustice when she sees it. And she's very clearly defined, even in the first chapter, but as was pointed out today, when you take a look at the very first paragraph of chapter 1, Elizabeth Zott is referred to as the 30-year-old mother of Madeline Zott. So it's a mother and she's 30 years old. We don't even know her name yet. We only find it in paragraph 3. So she's defined by her role, her age, and she's defined by someone else. So for such a strong character like Elizabeth Zott to become Elizabeth Zott, and I've got a quote, this is in chapter 6, the middle of chapter 6, Elizabeth Zott speaking. She says, quote, "I want to be judged on my own work, not work people think you did for me." She's talking to Calvin. And then he says, "Anyone who knows you would never think that." Next sentence, "She burped the Tupperware, then turned to look at him. That's the problem. No one knows me." And then a few sentences later, "In the past, she was either the offspring of an arsonist, the daughter of a serial wife, the sister of a hanged homosexual, or the graduate student of a renowned lecher. Now she was the girlfriend of a famous chemist, but she was never just Elizabeth Zott." And there was no way that she could be Elizabeth Zott until
because she was in Calvin's shadow.
Because she would always be in Calvin's shadow.
Right.
And he actually did go to Donati to help her, even though she explicitly told him not to do that. So he was pulling strings for her in a way that would always undermine her own identity. And so he had to go because fundamentally the story is not a love story. There's a love story in there, but it's not about her relationship with Calvin. It's about her becoming her best Elizabeth Zott, right?
Yeah. It's reminiscent of this post that was going around a while back where it was like, but she's somebody's, daughter, sister, mother, etc. And then all the lines are crossed out except for she's somebody. And it was a very trendy post that was saying, anyway, not related to the text, sorry guys.
No,
but it
because
was
we
relevant
talked
to
about
society.
that because how she's defined is in her relationship to other people. It's never about who she is and the work that she does.
Mm-hmm.
And that very much describes women in the 1950s.
And today.
And
well, it's the reason the post is going around today. It's still relevant.
Yeah. But I think, like you said, it was even more extreme. Like women weren't allowed to have bank accounts.
They weren't allowed to have their own credit cards.
Right.
Yeah. Well, even Avery Parker says, this is my family's foundation, but I need to have a male because I'm not married, because I'm not allowed to carry out any financial transactions as a woman.
Right. Well, let's talk about the cover.
Okay.
I think it's time.
Yeah.
If we're going to talk about the love story, we have to talk about the way that the publisher has deceived their audience.
In the U.S. market.
In the U.S. market, to be
Yes.
clear, because this book has been translated into 42 different languages. And if you go to Bonnie Garmus's website, you'll find the covers for books in each language.
She did not like the American cover.
Yeah. Probably the UK cover is the one she likes.
The Chinese cover is pretty cool. It's just a beaker and she's inside of it. Have you seen it?
Show
Yeah,
it to
it's
us.
got like little flowers around it. I like it. And this dog, mad. It's nice. I like the Chinese one. I think the Chinese one is actually one of the better ones.
So let's discuss the cover of this one.
It's a really interesting, would you call that peach background?
Salmon? I'd call it like a salmon color.
Yeah, salmon's a pinkish color.
Which is a bold color. And then you've got sans serif type on the title and the author's name. And then you have kind of this suggestion of a woman's head with just some blonde hair in a bun held in place by a number 2 pencil, of
As
course.
in the book.
And she's got some sunglasses on, and all you see is her lips and her eyes and her eyebrows, and she's looking off to the side. Like
She's looking skeptically off to the side.
Yeah.
She's
And within the sunglasses.
within
and
the
inside
sunglasses.
inside the sunglasses, there are beakers or chemical
And test tubes.
things.
And test tubes.
But when you take a look at it, what I come away with from that is the look on her face, the wistful look on her face. And it doesn't scream serious literature to me at all.
No, it feels very rom-com or, commercial women's fiction, which this does kind of fall into, except for in a story arc fashion, or I should say a character arc fashion. It does in a story arc fashion. It does come across really playful. Like this book is going to be light and fun.
I don't know. She's not smiling and she's giving somebody the side eye.
Yeah, it looks kind of sassy.
So it's a little attitude, I think, in that.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess
her
I'm going to
face.
say is from a publishing standpoint, this cover is very reminiscent of the last 3-ish years of rom-com covers in that it's cartoon.
Yeah.
There's no man on the cover, so you're not getting that romance side. There's no hearts or anything like that. But the cartoony bright colors does put it, like if you're looking at them on a shelf, it would feel like that just because of the colors and the style they chose. And I think that's one of the reasons Bonnie didn't like it. She thinks it came across... Bonnie, we're good friends.
Yeah.
Why Garmus
You're
didn't
tight.
Why Garmus didn't like it is because it doesn't give the seriousness of the topic.
It comes
in
off
which-
as lightweight.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree.
Which when we're talking about a book that has depicts rape, which depicts, constant, I don't know, just come up with it's a heavy topic, and there's lots of rage involved, and a lot of women who read this felt their rage vindicated.
There's suicide, there's abandonment, there's so many plagues. I mean, it's a very dark book, which is leavened with Garmus's humor, which is abundant. And so you've got that balance of very serious and humorous. And that is one of the themes of the book, is balance, because as Garmus points out, chemical equations are a balance. One thing equals another. One thing becomes another. And she was very conscious of that when she chose chemistry as her metaphor for the way that the sexes interact.
The way that people bond or connect.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about POV.
Yes.
And Garmus, very charmingly, in one of the audience interactions that I saw, apologized to her readers for all the different points of view, sort of saying, like, gee, I hope you could follow along. Well, of course you could follow along, because she does it very, very well.
Yeah, it's very accessible writing.
Incredibly accessible. And I just want to get really angry on all the writing teachers who tell their students they can only have one point of view? Like, what ridiculous.
Well, because if it's done badly, it's a disaster.
I think it's because of head hopping. We have to use the word head hopping here. She doesn't head hop. When she changes characters for a segment of time without being like, oh, I'm going into this person and this person. And there's some really clear techniques you can use in order to change point of view that when you're first starting out, you probably don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And so staying in one POV when you're first starting out until you've learned these techniques is very important. But we can learn from what she did.
Yeah, you can use it as a direct template. I mean, she does it very, very well. So when she talks to audiences, she says, oh, I have 10 points of view. And it's like, well, you guys know me, right?
Gary's like, I counted. There are 25.
There are 25 points of view, except not Avery Parker's.
Not Avery Parker. Feels like it, but no.
Yeah.
She's just talking a lot.
And then also, so what I do want to talk about, like what makes a good POV change. I do want to talk about that. But before we do, let's talk about the POV at the very beginning of the book. And so I'll quote part of the opening paragraph. Back in 1961, when women wore shirtwaist dresses and joined garden clubs and drove legions of children around in seatbeltless cars without giving it a second thought, back before anyone knew there'd even be a 60s movement, much less one that its participants would spend the next 60 years chronicling, blah, blah, blah. Okay, she goes on. So what's the point of view here?
It's just a narrator, right?
So we're circling from above.
Yeah, the point of view is God, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like godlike.
Yeah.
Omniscient.
And it's really an omniscient point of view, but it's very much biblical.
Yeah.
The Bible is an omniscient point of view. And that's the classic example of omniscient point of view. And so this is very biblical because it's almost like in the beginning was the Word, right? So in 1961, in those crazy days, let's spin the globe back, however many years, and we're gonna visit one Elizabeth Zott in California and take a look at her story. And so I think that sets it up. I think that's part of what makes all the different points of view really accessible. I mean, some points of view are just a paragraph or two. We've got the woman in Santa Monica. We've got the La Jolla woman in Curlers. We've got the little boy in Van Nuys. But it works so well.
Well, she sets it up in the beginning. Like, very quickly because of that, narrator in the opening section that you're not ever in one person's head. And then you kind of like move from one to the next. And so we become used to it. So when there is a switch, we're already established. One issue, I think, is sometimes when you stay in one person's head for a long time and then there's just a sudden switch into somebody else's head and the reader isn't expecting it. It's really jarring and it pulls you out. So that's something she did well. She had quickly established there's going to be changes.
In the first chapter, which is pretty short, we start with that omniscient. Then we go to Elizabeth Zott. Then we go to Madeline. Then we go back to Elizabeth Zott. So there's already like 4 maybe different changes just there. And I think you're right. It does set us up so that it's like, oh, okay, these are the ground rules. Because I agree, if it had been one for a long period of time and then we start head hopping, it's like, what's going on?
And also outside of the opening, she stays third close the rest of the time. She's not switching into first person.
No,
it's always third person.
Let's talk about the rules of good POV switching. And I think one of the primary ones is you say the person's name right up front. You just have to.
Yeah.
One of the techniques that I think she uses a few times, I'm not sure if it's naturally or something she learned, but it's almost like you have to use a camera lens that starts really far away and then moves closer. Have we talked about this before?
No, but actually, as Gary was talking, I was just thinking, I can see why people would immediately see this as a film or like the series that it became, because you can actually see the camera hovering overhead above these people's lives and then moving in and then hopping between characters like on a screen. That's how I saw it.
Yeah. I don't have a text example ready. Maybe Gary does,
But please go on. You had a train of thought.
Yeah, just the idea that the camera's moving in. So the first sentence would be like, Gary was sitting there with an apple, and then Gary took a bite out of an apple and it was juicy and flesh. And then and then you can put in Gary's thought, because you're kind of like zooming in, like there's the picture of him, the action, and then you're moving in. So you're just getting closer and closer. So that's something that people can do. Also, once you get used to it, you don't need to do that much work. You can just add, as if you're reading the book, it's just a gap. It's just a gap in pages. And you kind of know, you expect the character change.
Yeah. In chapter 1, she does it very quickly. Madeline understood this. Then we go into Madeline's head briefly. Very effective use of POV, folks. Study this book.
And I will say there are a couple sections where I had to stop and go like, wait, whose head am I in? And like, if I read a certain section right now, like I'm not immediately certain because she does jump around. And I do think she often uses a sense of narrator. Now, I will say for her using narrator, which you're not in the person's head, there's no interiority. She uses that very well. But then when she's in Elizabeth Zott's interiority, it is some of the most solid and enticing interiority. Even if it's Elizabeth just musing on something, she keeps you entertained because Elizabeth's musings are very entertaining and so well written and so clear. So I also think beyond POV, studying this book for great commercial style interiority is really important because often we only see it really in depth in super deep literature, and it's what kind of pulls it to that upmarket level.
Mm-hmm.
Hear, hear.
I know we're sold the book on the log line of a chemist having a famous TV show, but the book is actually about finding family and found family when you look at the climax and the resolution of the story and what Matt investigated the whole time. So as much as we want it to be about like Elizabeth Zott's journey, and we talked about this briefly in that,
and it is about her,
but she doesn't grow, she doesn't change,
she does. We had this conversation.
Yeah, we did
discuss this.
Well, how did she change?
And
I think she changed the things around her, not necessarily.
No, but she became more open and receptive to other people, where she had been just a loner and isolated and kind of an orphan and cut off from everyone. Like she opens herself to Calvin, and then she eventually opens herself to
Avery. Yeah.
Oh, but that's the end of the book.
Oh,
Yeah.
I guess you
That
could
comes
say.
late. I mean, because do you remember there's this scene where they have Sunday dinners, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of this family that forms. And we talked about this also. It's kind of the people who are on the fringes or the people who are like the misfits, and they kind of find each other and they form their own family.
Actually, the strongest evidence that Elizabeth Zott doesn't change is a quote from Barney Garmus, who says Elizabeth Zott doesn't change. Right? So it's like, okay, fine.
She remains stoic and ethical and moral.
But however,
Yes.
by the end of the book, when Avery Parker enters her life, there's a quote, except to say that we had chemistry. She's talking to Avery about her relationship with Calvin, actual chemistry, and it was no accident. And maybe it was finally using the word accident, but the crushing weight of what she lost overtook her, and she laid her head on Avery Parker's shoulder and sobbed in a way she never had before.
Right.
So the dam had burst, and she actually let somebody else into her life.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a little bit of change, right?
No, and you've opened my eyes because actually you could say that the climax of her character arc would be her opening up to Roth during the life interview. And then from her perspective, it completely backfired. Her opening up was, that was like her big giant. She opened up publicly to a reporter about everything. And he went away and was like, I'm actually not going to tell her story, because he was like, that's too private. Like he learned. Anyway, but then what came out was, a slew of garbage from Not Roth. But then the article that finally came out, that really helped. In Vogue,
yeah.
That really helped was Roth's story about women and not just her.
Yeah.
So you could say that her opening up did eventually lead to the full climax because she had to get to a point. Anyway, see, I'm already walking around.
No, it's good. It's good that we have this. See, this is why we have this discussion.
This is why you need to talk it out because you can have one view. And this is what I think is so great about our group is so often, I know a lot of us feel the same way, is we go there with our views and our notes and we think about something. Maybe we hate a book, maybe we love it, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's not what we're there to discuss. But you come away with other ideas about how the book could be viewed.
For 9/10 of the book, Elizabeth is a catalyst for others' change.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the reasons that Garmus wanted to give her this huge TV platform so that she would be able to be seen by a large number of women who would be able to affect change. And I think if we believe in the pillars of the thirds and the quarters of a book, at about the 3/4 mark, we finally have Marjorie Phyllis, the one that she said, you really ought to be going to med school. And then she changed that woman's life. And that's the moment that she does that. So from that moment on, we start to see more and more evidence of people's life changing. And part of that is through the Q&A at the end of each episode of the TV show, but also her daughter, Mad, has this similar sort of mojo, because when she interacts with Wakely, she's actually an instrument of change with Wakely. And there's this gorgeous little passage in chapter 28 where Mad has the Reverend thinking about growing his hair out like the Beatles do. and then there's a quote, "They sat quietly for a few moments, Madeline skimming her finger down the phone book pages, the Reverend considering the purchase of a guitar." So it's like she's having, her daughter's having this positive effect.
They're both catalysts.
They're both catalysts,
in a chemical reaction. Mm-hmm.
And also because Elizabeth is a Stoic.
Yeah.
And Stoics are kind of if you think about Marcus Aurelius and his place in philosophy, he's kind of the rock in the storm, right?
Yeah.
That's the image of the Stoic. And that's very much who Elizabeth was. And part of that wonderful scene at the end with Avery is her kind of just acknowledging that she can't do it all by herself.
And what precedes that, this is in chapter 39. This is Elizabeth. Having finished her daily lunchbox notes to Madeline, Elizabeth closed the lid, then pretended to fuss with a Bunsen burner. For the last few weeks, she'd done her best to keep her head up. Ignore the article, she told herself. Carry on. That was the coping strategy that had carried her through suicide, sexual assault, lies, thievery, and catastrophic loss. It would again, except it hadn't. This time, no matter how high she lifted her head, life's misrepresentation of who she was beat her back down again. The damage felt permanent, like a brand. She would never outrun it. So I think what happens at the end with Avery Parker is her release. Her finally finding that stoicism is not always effective in life. And you need to lean on other people and let them be your emotional release.
That's actually, I thought it was a lampshading, but maybe it was just stating theme in the opening when Evan says it.
Calvin, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking to Donati about getting her funding for abiogenesis. Mm-hmm. He says, I think it's to himself, in validating his reasoning for kind of going behind her back. It's that, everyone needs help. No one can do it on their own. Like even he had help, so to speak.
Tonight we're drinking a cocktail called Beat Down, made from beet-infused gin. Whitney chose this drink because the name evokes Elizabeth Zott being beat down by the men around her until she's not. The recipe calls for ginger syrup, which Whitney made. Oh, and we also learned the importance of having a cocktail shaker with a tight lid. That's foreshadowing. Can you describe how you made it?
This is the ginger simple syrup. Yeah, so it was peeled and chopped fresh ginger.
Okay.
And you put that in a pot with, it's a lot of work peeling ginger, for the record. And you put that into a saucepan with a cup of sugar and a cup of water. You boil it till the sugar dissolves, and then you steep it for 15 to 20 minutes. And you can strain it if you don't want a super strong ginger flavor, or you can throw the whole thing after it's steeped into a blender and mix it up, which is why it's super thick, because it's actually ginger in there.
It looks like it has the consistency
like lemon curd.
Yeah, I was going to
looks
say
like
that.
lemon curd.
Isn't that gingery?
Wow. That's what gives it its sweetness and a little spice. So for each one, it's 1 ounce of ginger.
Oh, 1 ounce.
1 ounce of ginger for each shaker. Yeah.
I don't know if that's going to pour.
We'll see.
Yeah, it did.
I'm afraid I'm going to lose this and stain everything white.
And it's going to be feet everywhere.
Feet everywhere.
Because we know that comes out of things usually.
Exactly. Ooh, that gets cold.
And
just like we predicted. I'm so sorry.
Oh dear.
Oh, Mira.
Oh, dear.
Your houndstooth jacket.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Clean up on aisle 5. 10 minutes, half a roll of paper towels, and 1 bottle of San Pellegrino later. That is gorgeous.
Yes, I literally so impressed with how much that came out.
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, we should do a little thing on club soda and beet juice.
We should.
Thanks,
we should.
That's bonus episode for Patreon supporters.
Wait a second. I don't have my camera on.
Oh, Mira.
Seriously. I am.
Deb is like, you're banned from this fucking house.
Maybe it's time to go to your office.
Maybe it's not.
Oh God, no.
No, okay. So we're gonna
No.
drink these here,
Yes.
standing in place.
Yes.
And nobody's gonna touch
This
it.
isn't going anywhere near my office.
I'm gonna put the bag before it's
The blue
spilled.
thing that's everything's on there. That works really well.
Okay, this is going back into the bag so it doesn't cause any more damage.
Okay.
All right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I would pay good money for this in a bar.
I have paid good money for this at a bar.
This exact drink?
Yeah. I told you I got this from J&L Distilling's website. Did I tell you that? Before J&L, they closed their tasting room.
My God. It's a
Overall-
gin distiller?
They make Snow, S-N-O, Snow Gin, Snow Vodka, something called Fire,
And where are they?
F-Y-R-E. They're on Pearl Parkway. You know that strip mall behind the
Oh,
Toyota
they're
dealership?
local. They're here.
local. They're in Boulder.
Oh.
And they used to, he's a distillery that used to have a tasting room. And this is the drink that I used to always get there.
If you'd like to make your own beat down, the recipe is at jldistilling.com/recipe. Now back to Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus.
If you notice, there's very little setting details throughout this book. If I think back to many of the scenes, it was kind of just like a few details here and there, and then it's just like a white glow because
Right.
I don't have a clear picture, or I'm putting places I have been or have previously read in this. And I think that also makes for we're constantly in scene or interiority, and we're just burned through this book. Like, it is a page turner in which you could skim almost, because like you're not losing a logistical thread very quickly. So it's a really easy book to just like start and finish, and you're never getting bogged down and having to like skip, like paragraphs of description or long segments there. And if you did, guess what? You're going to figure it out because she's going to re-explain it to you.
A really charming anecdote that Garmus tells about when she met with a group of Korean readers. And one of the questions that came up was, is every character Korean? I'm going to let that drop for a moment because there's very little physical description.
Mm-hmm.
We know that Elizabeth Sott is beautiful.
And blonde.
And she's blonde. And we know that Calvin is ugly and tall and lanky.
Awkward
right?
and gangly.
But there's very little physical description. We don't know race. There's a lot that she leaves out. And what that does is it's great for translators because then they can create Korean or Saudi or French characters because the American limiting description isn't even in there.
Wow.
Isn't
So
that
it makes
cool?
the story
That's
more.
fabu-
It
that's
makes the story more
fascinating.
universal,
Yeah.
right? You can put yourself in.
Well,
the-
and also combine that with the fact that the whole male-female relation issue throughout history is pretty universal. And she did draw their caricatures, but they're well-known caricatures in probably every culture. There's the lech, there's the abusive husband, there's whatever, right? They're all there. And so it's like you can easily say, yeah, they're all Korean.
Yeah, they're all men. Jeez. Sorry, Gary.
Can I say I'm just a little uncomfortable here?
A cool thing that I think Garmus did really well in the beginning of the book, and I often am really encouraging other authors to learn from, is how she kind of starts in one section. She's like, the book opens where she's like already depressed and running the cooking show. And then we jump back to, when she's first getting started. And then we jump again. Often this doesn't work when authors try this. And one of the reasons is because they open really strong with whatever that prologue or first chapter is. But then they hope that they've already hooked the reader. And so the next parts aren't as strong. But with Elizabeth Zott's story, each opening could have been the opening of the book. Each opening paragraph was strong enough and hooky enough and had enough curiosity built into it and enough conflict built into that scene that it could have been the opening of its own book. And I think that's really important to note, that if you're going to be jumping timelines, after you set your reader in one section and then move them into another section, you need to open like you're opening the book again, because you've just changed stories essentially. And if it's not strong, you're going to lose the reader really quickly.
So you're saying those opening chapters, each chapter has an engaging paragraph. Is that what you're saying?
She's building
Engaging
curiosity.
opening.
All the things that when you take any courses, if you're a writer out there and you're taking courses on what do they say you need to have in your opening 5 pages to hook a reader? You need to build curiosity, you need to connect to setting, you need to connect to character. you need to have a conflict in there or a change or something, have the reader ask a question so that they'll keep reading. All of these pieces are necessary, again, if you change time and place or character quickly within the first part of the book, or again, any time in the book. If you're changing plot, time, character, you need to have that change until the reader can then feel sucked into that side of the story.
And she does start in medias res at a very interesting moment at the end of the first paragraph in chapter 1. Her life was over.
Yeah.
And the next time that she says her life is over, chapter 39, it's Harriet. I said, I'm not interested. She snapped. What was the point? Her life was over. And that was the callback. Copy of life in
Mine
her
is
hands.
Harriet,
Yeah.
because Harriet's not in the first scene of the book. We meet her later, but she's there. She's there to keep Madeline.
It's Life magazine.
Life is dead to me.
It's not...
And I know this is completely random and not apropos to
dead
what
to
we're
me.
discussing right now, but we talked about anachronisms. And there were some there like dead to me. It's such a current phrase. And I'm like, are they saying that's dead to me in 1952 to 1961? And how Walter and Elizabeth were best friends. They had each other's backs. I'm like, ugh.
Yeah, and then the wait, what? I mean, that's a very
exactly.
contemporary
There were
thing.
just a couple of little like sprinkles of things that like stopped and you said, wait a minute, what decade is this?
Yeah, the one that I picked up on was, and I did an entire timeline, by the way, because
Of course you did.
I'm a nerd, was when Harriet was mentioning that Mad was different than most other girls because she didn't play with her Barbies.
Yeah.
And I thought, wait a minute, Barbie didn't exist then. But in fact, she did.
By a few months.
Barbie was released in, I think, March or April of 1959. And I had to go back and figure out when that sentence is actually uttered. And it's uttered toward the end of 1959, which is a little bit too close. But Barbie did make a smash.
Yeah.
I'll give her a pass.
I mean, she mentions Donati thinking that maybe he should be a bartender because he really does like to drink and he's good at it. And he uses the word mixology. I'm like,
oh, yeah.
When was that coined?
That's a recent coin.
But this, these kind of things, I think, in a book like this are expected. Like, there's so much about this book that asks us to suspend our disbelief in reality. And it's like, I know it's not fantasy, but it's what I think of when I think of like fantasy contemporary literature, because nobody's reading this book thinking this is real. This is real.
This is historically accurate.
Yeah. And I think, because we all read so much literature, like, a capital L literature, put it that way, those books tend to read, even if they're speculative or sci-fi, like a little more like someone's memoir, in that the voice feels and the way the motivations are crept up and the way the explanations are kind of laid out, they feel more true to life, and that you don't need to suspend disbelief. And this book, I think you can kind of get away with all those things because, we're in a dog's head. The 4-year-old is reading Charles Dickens.
So this is what I mentioned in the discussion, the four different areas that pulled me out of the story. And one of them was like the anachronisms like this. One of them was being in a point of view of the dog, which was pushing boundaries for me. I wasn't.
Which some people liked.
I liked it. I mean, I just think I just opened this book and suspended disbelief because I'm in a 4-year-old's head who's reading Charles Dickens, like that level.
And the sound and the fury.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the moments that any book that I read, whether we consider it like commercially, like, popular or successful, whatever, or literature with a capital L, I'm just kind of aware of things, but anything that pulls me out of a story is a bad thing, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, and those are the things that would pull me out. I'm like, she went just a little too far with this line. This paragraph was perfect, and then she added these 2 sentences, which was over the top.
I do want to talk at some point about her wonderful use of metaphor.
Yeah.
But for now, let's talk about the fact that everything is dialed to 11
Yes.
in this book. And
Yes.
it's in service to, I think, a form of satire, in that she's drawing not cartoonish characters, but overdrawn characters, because she has this wicked sense of humor that works when you confront these overblown characters. But it's laid on quite thick, because if you think about the childhood of Elizabeth Zott, I mean, she has 2 horrible parents, and her homosexual brother commits suicide, and her father's in jail, and her mother has run away to Brazil. But that's not all, folks. We've got Calvin, who, was born to a mother who wasn't, even awake when she had him, and the baby was taken away, and of course she was told that he was dead, and the bishop lies to Wilson to say that Calvin has died, and it's just, the level of misery, just any one of those would have been enough to propel a novel.
Sure.
But she piles on 8 of them.
Layers of
right?
trauma.
And it's like, okay, enough already. I think, it's laid on a little bit too thick. I want to throw in a little observation about usage of words. Like Walter Pine's boss, his name is Laban Small. Small life.
The one who shoves his genitals in her face.
Yeah. And then Reverend Wakely,
Yeah.
he's so woke.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And then also the fact that he's looking at Mad magazine as he encounters Mad.
I thought about that
Mad
too.
Zot, right? So
I was wondering if that was purposeful, because I almost felt like it was like...
A little too on the nose.
Well, I was like, it's a relevant magazine at that time, but also I would have picked one that didn't have the same name.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah, it was an interesting choice.
I wanted to think a little bit more about why this has been on the bestsellers list for so long. What makes it a trendy? Why did Felicity hear this pitch at a cocktail party and go, I will sign this person on 10,000 words? Because that says it's like, clearly she's got the writing skills. She's been critiqued. She's gone through a course. She understands the basics of storytelling. She's smart. She's witty. She's an easy person to put on a stage. Clearly all of those things matter at this point. But what were the topics, and you guys can answer this, within the book that made it so easy for Felicity to want to sign?
Ooh, is this a question?
Yeah, it's a question.
I have one. Feminism?
Women in STEM, huge trending topic.
Yeah.
What I said in the discussion today, I thought that this book was a kind of a wish fulfillment for a lot of women who've been underappreciated and undervalued, particularly by male colleagues. And there's a very satisfying ending where certain characters get their comeuppance. I don't know how deep we want to go into spoilers, but I think it's an extremely satisfying book. It's like all the things that you wish you had said to somebody in the middle of a meeting as a woman to a man or a group of men that you didn't say, that Elizabeth Zott, it comes out of her mouth.
Yeah, exactly. Very satisfying. And also how, some books, she's not glorifying one avenue or the other. She totally was saying being a housewife and taking care of your family is very important. What you're doing is important work.
It's the most undervalued job in the world.
Yeah. While also being, a woman in STEM who, was out there doing science and wanted to accomplish more and encouraging this idea of accomplish more. So I think so often feminism has one angle, and this book was good about accomplishing both.
I think the strongest rail in the book is the truth that misogyny in the 50s hasn't really changed all that much.
It was more exaggerated back then. And I would actually say that one of the most effective parts about this book is setting it in the past, in the 60s or 50s, because it does take the conflict up tenfold. Having a child out of wedlock. Can we even use the term illegitimate child anymore? I think that's kind of not PC.
Just say bastard. I think that's PC.
Yeah. Oh, that's much more PC.
Kid. Poor Matt.
Is that more PC?
I think
not?
illegitimate is still okay, but
I don't know.
not bastard child.
I don't know.
Illegitimate.
I think setting it in the 50s, 60s is really what made the conflict higher, that put the stakes higher for Elizabeth. If you put the same story set in 2024, what year is it? It probably wouldn't have been the same level of conflict, or would have had to force that conflict more.
I was going to say that actually, to me, one of the problems that I had with the book is that I felt like it was a 2022, 2023 mindset set in 1952, 1961. I felt like there were things that came out of her mouth. I think somebody in our group, Elizabeth, alluded to this in the discussion today, that she wasn't so certain a character at that time would say these things to these people. Right. And I had to agree with her.
She was a little bit forward on homosexuality, on atheism.
No woman should be forced to have a baby against her will. There's certain things that she said that I'm like, what a woman has said this in this. I wasn't alive then. I don't know.
For Elizabeth Zott to be so 100% correct on all the views is a little bit unrealistic.
Totally. And those things would make it a literary novel if she had changed those things.
Right.
It would not have been an 86-week best-selling novel. And this is often what we have to think about. Like, you can write that first book for yourself. But when you're writing it for an audience, who is your audience? They're people living and breathing in 2024.
Sure.
And they want that mentality that they can relate to. So it was an effective thing, even though it's not true. And Elizabeth was correct that, people in the 1960s and 50s wouldn't have thought those things or said those things in that way. It just wasn't part of social impact. We do now, and this is the audience reading it. So it was effective, and that's one of the other reasons it's been on the bestsellers list for so long. It touches on the Me Too movement in a big way, which is only more recently relevant and not something that would have been happening then. So I feel like that's sort of bucking off of a recent trend and has been very popular in fiction over the last couple of years. It's hard to ignore the fact that outside of the first chapter, which is actually a prologue, if you think about it, and I think this is really funny because agents are always like, do not send us your prologue and just call it a first chapter. We can tell it's a prologue. Well, clearly this book was published with a prologue that is a first chapter. But it works because it sets you in a genre that is not a romance, because the next opening with, her meeting Calvin and all of that story it's such a meet cute. It's a romance novel starting, but we know it's not going to end in a romance because we know where Elizabeth ends up. And so that first chapter is definitely a part of the story and works itself in and sets the genre. But I do think that romance storyline, and then later on, Harriet and Walter Pine, their romance is part of what makes this a bestseller. I do think in commercial books, a love story is necessary in a lot of ways. Let's start talking about the difference between literature and commercial fiction, because it is such a debated topic and there really is no clear-cut answer for it. So I'm going to throw this next idea to Molly McGee, who's one of my favorite authors. Yeah. Sorry, I can't not talk about her. But this was an idea she introduced to me that I've been talking about ever since. And it really is about logistics in writing. And sometimes it comes across a bit stage directing. And when a writer is really good at stage directing the novel so that the reader is following through on every step throughout it, that tends to lean more commercially heavy because anybody can pick it up and follow that through. When a writer starts dropping some stage directing and expects the reader to make jumps, it also starts leading more literary, because that way the reader is like just playing along. You have to kind of make some assumptions. You have to make your own observations about characters and what's going on in the scene and what may have taken place or will take place in order to grasp. And those things, that's not what Bonnie Garmus did. Like, she laid it all out. It is a very logistically heavy stage-directed novel. Yeah. And it works. It is very accessible.
When you start to provide too many details, you're kind of talking down to the reader.
Exactly.
And the example that I always go back to is like a Dan Brown, whose descriptions are like Wikipedia entries, because he's introducing you to these exotic locations, but he also wants to bring the reader along so that they understand the significance of, I don't know, the Gaudi Cathedral in Barcelona.
My favorite was the Maman, the bronze spider sculpture outside of the Bilbao Guggenheim.
Oh, the Louise Bourgeois.
Yes, exactly.
Another way that she did this was in over-explaining her motivations.
Yes.
So, or even just like how 630 got to the studio. I had actually assumed up until that point that he would have been in the studio with her, because didn't he go to the office with her previously? But then there was this page-long description of how he got to the studio.
Well, he needed to pick up Mad from school.
So wouldn't have just made more sense from the beginning to have Harriet keep picking her up? But then she over-explained why, how the dog would have done this, which in something that was maybe falls more upmarket or literary leaning, you would have just said something and let the reader figure the rest out. Right. And then this also
let the reader
happened.
Connect the dots.
My guess on that motivation was, we have a single mother who's also a working mother, and she's got a daughter that really she needs to take care of. Who's going to take care of her? And if it's not the woman across the street, if it's not the neighbor, then it has to be the dog. And the dog has to be super smart so that the reader gets, oh yeah, that's a responsible choice. Yeah, putting Matt in, under the direction and the care of a dog.
Well, then the ending, we're not gonna gripe on that one. The ending where Avery over-explains how hard she had, how hard she tried to get in contact and why it failed and all these things. It was just like a very long explanation about all of it.
Yeah.
And that is also what's needed in commercial fiction.
Right.
In something that was more upmarket or literary leaning, you would have left more gaps. You would have let the reader interpret and make assumptions and observations about these things. It was just emotionally heavy. It was a hard thing to do. It wouldn't need to be said on the page in the same way that she elicited it.
There were a few too many coincidences at the end that all stacked up.
That's the other thing about the whole theme of like stretching the limits of credibility,
Right.
like the fact that that Matt and Wakely just happen to run into each other at the library, that Wakely just happens to be the minister who performs the funeral service for Calvin, that Frask just happens to work for Wakely typing up his sermons. I mean, there were little... I'm like, there's a little. It's a little too pat. It's a little too tidy.
You know, the second time I read it, I could see more of how she wove it in. But I got to tell you, the first time I read it, it just felt artificial. Like they were just piling up.
And this is where I say it's not fantasy, but it's fantasy fiction in a way. Because we, like from the beginning, we are told to suspend our disbelief. We know this couldn't happen in real life. And I guess maybe that's why none of that pulled me out of the book necessarily, is because I was like, well, this isn't real. This wouldn't have really happened. And I just felt that fantasy level of reading fiction, even though there was nothing fantastical.
Well, I felt like what I
about
described this book as is fantasy fulfillment.
Yeah.
In the discussion today. Yeah.
And the coincidental information, and I want to say this to writers out there, so much of what was led as a coincidence, if she had just brought it up sooner in the book before it came up in the actual point, it would have been, it feels more satisfying for the reader instead of it feeling like a coincidence. I think there's a point where Elizabeth noticed Wilson's cufflinks and remembers the letters. Or
at the very end.
At the very end. Yeah, this is just an example from the text. Just an example from the text. If those cufflinks had been made a bigger deal of at some point, maybe they were described heavilier, in a way that stands out to the reader. And this is another thing. This is where literature comes in. Literature will spend a paragraph describing these cufflinks because they know all of a sudden Elizabeth Zott is going to see these cufflinks later on in the book, and the reader's going to go, oh, they were Wilson's. She remembers from the letter, because that paragraph soaked their attention. But when they're reading that paragraph, they're going, why are we spending a paragraph reading cufflinks? But you let yourself do that in literature. Yeah. And so then when you read it, you're like, oh, that's so satisfying because I'm putting those pieces together myself. Yes. The author doesn't have to spell it out for me.
Thanks for staying with us. Hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us next month when we discuss Victory City by Salman Rushdie. Thanks to my cohort, Whitney Pinion, Mira Landry, and the Boulder Writers Alliance, sponsors of this group since 2018. Please visit writerswhoread.com for a discussion guide of this book, as well as all the other novels we've covered. If you'd like to join us online or in person for one of our upcoming discussions, a complete list of future books and registration info is available at writerswhoread.com/live. Please subscribe to our monthly newsletter for the latest updates and share this podcast with your fellow readers and writers. We look forward to hearing from you and maybe meeting up at a future event. Till next month, I'm Gary McBride wishing you happy reading and happy writing. Writers Who Read is a production of InRes Media.